Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. So today on the Econ Show, we're going to break things down into 5 different pieces. So the first one, we're going to provide an update on Russia-Ukraine, what is happening there. But we want to look at really the food side, because we have talked extensively about what it means for oil and energy in general, but we want to go deeper on the food front and how things are shifting, because there is a significant amount of fallout from that side, especially on the fertilizer and the other impacts, and what that's going to do to inflation on a global level, not just on a US level. Then we're going to look at how inflation is from the U.S. perspective is firmly in the driver's seat right now, and the Fed officially raised rates today. Unfortunately, I won't have too many charts on it because it happened just as we started filming, but it was the 25 basis points. I don't think anybody didn't expect that. It was very much in line. I've said from February of 2021 that we were going to see at least 4 rate hikes in 2022, and here we are. My view is that we see 25 basis point increase, 3 in a row, a delay, and then a 4th. Maybe we see the 7. I don't know. We'll see. There's a lot to talk about in terms around that. Then we're going to look at some of the consumer parts are going to also be in part 2, because we want to look at wages and real wages versus nominal. Where is spending going? Because there are a lot of hiccups and unknowns in this, because one of the things that when you look at what happened in 2011 with food and the Arab Spring, or if you leave the U.S., the peasant uprising, it's not just food at this point. There's so many other impacts right now, and that's where we think that there's going to be a very broad hit to many different people. So we want to look at what are those different pieces. And then we want to look at Europe, and they're really going to be hit the hardest by Russia-Ukraine, with their chance of a recession increasing exponentially due to pricing pressures. They already had a weak consumer, and we'll talk about that more in detail. And then we want to turn to Asia, where some of the Chinese data that came out was better. Obviously, it picks up the Lunar New Year, which is always a big year. A big part of the year and a big spending part of the year. But the data comes out just as you have this broad lockdown and these broad things that are going to create some pretty extensive slowdowns. So again, it's just going to be a matter of timing, but we'll talk more about that when we get into segment 5. So now, as we go through these different pieces, we always are going to kick off with what is happening with Ukraine, Russia. So when you look at where some of the adjustments are, Kyiv still stands. They're still been able to hold off from the advances when you look at coming from Sumy across. They're continuing to push through. They're trying to get around some key areas to try to make a beeline and try to confront it from multiple angles. So far, the Ukrainians have had some decent success in terms of their counterattacks, slowing down the supply chain, slowing down the movements. But some of the things that, again, constantly reading about this, I think some people have had a very good take where you can be strategic and have big losses, and then you can have but at the same time you cannot be strategic and still win. So when you look at this, there is a strategy. I think that you can't argue the fact that there is a strategy. It's kind of playing out in the sense of, take Kyiv, but not just that isn't the only function. They also want to cut off a large part of the eastern part of Europe, of Ukraine, and then close off the water to Ukraine in general. So you're seeing it. It's playing out. So the strategy is there, but instead of being having a strategic mind, it's almost like they're using just blunt force. Like they just don't care who dies as long as the objective is clear. And unfortunately, if you take the Russian mantra going back through World War II, that was always kind of the case, like just throw more bodies at it and it'll be achieved, which is the unfortunate side of how this is going down, because, there is a, death that is happening, regularly, which is obviously terrible in all rights. But when you look at the southeast in Polo and the area around it, it's under Russian control. So one of the things, because everybody talks about Kiev, because obviously that's a rallying cry. There's a lot of propaganda and keeping the morale up. But when you look at the southeast in general, there's continuing to be a lot of movement and Russian advances. So when you look at Izium and Dnipro, you can see that there's additional moves. They're trying to essentially go around and add the Kiev row to that list, which is where the Russians are trying to push forward and capture that. So it would then open up a back door into Dnipro and Zaporizhzhia, I believe it is, but I'm most likely butchering it. And that would then allow them to kind of come around and then connect back down. So again, their strategy there, and it will be successful just by a sheer number of forces that are being thrown at it. There's a lot of counterattacks that are happening, and the Ukrainians are digging in. But in terms of their objectives, they will likely be achieved, just obviously not at the same speed in which it was hoped the Russians were hoping for, and with an extensive amount of losses. Now, as those losses mount up, and as anybody who has been in war knows, things can also change drastically. So I can say that Russia will achieve it, but maybe not. There's also morale. There's also, the how hardened are the Ukrainians that are there? What are they willing to fight? What is the U.S. going to do in NATO? There's now back and forth in terms of where things are on regards to providing drones, providing other types of equipment. They still have a lot of fighting power. They're still fighting very hard in terms of trying to solidify and again using their tactical retreats. Try to punch in the mouth, retreat, counterattack, and then trying to do that to draw them in. And I think it's so far been successful in slowing it down, but the sheer number of people involved, the sheer amount of equipment makes it difficult to be a long-term success. So when you look at the precarious situation in the northern part of the east, Russian troops have bypassed Kharkiv and are pushing into Izium, where there is fighting in the town. You can see that movement down because remember, they're trying to essentially cut off and then backfill, which I think they're trying to, because if you think about how the goods and equipment are going, they're going west to east. So they're trying to come in through the back door, shut off the supply chain, and then essentially force a surrender further in. So again, these are things that are continuing to happen. Ukrainian troops are holding defensive positions on the Donbass line, and they're in the danger of being enveloped by it. But so far, when you look at Donbass, the Ukrainians have been very successful in countering all of those attacks. But that's where the military really was. They were already dug in. So now they risk getting outflanked if you look at how they're looking to collapse in. But again, things that will continue to develop. Throughout all of this, you can see that the refugees have been fleeing. This chart is old. It is now over 1 million people and closer to, at this point, about 1.1 million. A lot of, you can see a large amount of them have gone to Poland and then beyond. And this is not something that's going to stop. The humanitarian corridors have not been able to open. But people have still been on the forefront trying to exit and trying to get to safety, with the most of the men and women who were still available trying to turn around and protect their homeland. So when you look at all the things that are happening right now, I think it's interesting to look at what's going on with China, Russia, because there's a lot of talk of, is China going to give support? Are they going to give military equipment? Did Russia really ask? Now, as we've said before, we don't believe Russia asked for kinetic force. But when you look at the loss of technology coming from South Korea, Japan, and Thailand, who have stopped all exports, technology exports to Russia, they need to replace that. And that's when they can turn to China and ask them to replace it. Will some of that end up in military equipment? Absolutely. But again, it's not a direct delivery where, Russia buys 1,000 tanks from China. So there's some of that pivot. But when you look at some of the how transactions have been done, so dollar receipts accounted for 97% of Russia's total exports to China in 2014. but fell to 37% as of 3Q 2021. For the euro, the share of euro trade rose from 1% to 48% during the same period. So that's why you have to look at how the preparation was. And again, Russia's been looking to get off of the dollar or away from the dollar, but they still have to rely on something. And the euro was kind of the fallback. So when you look at the loss of SWIFT, when you look at the loss of some of the activities and some of the payouts, it makes it difficult for them to continue to transact, which is why you can see that they're going to look to use something different, which will likely be a ruble yuan trade, but it would have to be at a fixed rate because China wants to make sure they get paid. But they also have to maintain some of that key neutrality because Russia is not as important to China from a net trade level. The U.S. is still the largest trade partner by a country mile versus Russia, but Russia provides very important products, oil, natural gas, things that the U.S. can't replace, but they need to keep the U.S. happy, U.S. allies happy, while they also try to transact with Russia, which is why you have such a difficult point. But again, you can see that this was something that was already being considered when you look at getting off of the dollar. Just giving an idea on how Ukraine port calls have gone. Here you can see how much they've declined in general. It just goes to show that it's essentially an all stop. There's nothing getting to the Ukrainian ports, which just means there's nothing getting out, which makes it much harder when you look at the food front, as well as everything from grains to sugars to fertilizers and everything that falls in between. So then when you start looking at reserve currency, because it's important to look at what China's looking to do, what Russia has done, and how this can create an inflationary spiral. So Russia's currency reserves aren't really money. The world is in for a shock. And what does that mean? It means that even though so none of the central banks have all of their reserves in one location. It's kind of spread throughout the world at different locations. So, Russia essentially lost almost half of their foreign reserves when they were locked out. So then when you look at China, how nervous are they going to be? They own half of the world's $15 trillion reserves. So if you look at that, well, what happens if China has something similar happen? And the reason why that's the case is because China is the largest exporter. The U.S. is the largest buyer. So when you look at the reserves, they're going to have a lot of reserves and a lot of that deficit the U.S. deficit is going to be as a positive on their books. And there's going to be some of that piece of, well, what happens if it just goes away? What is the sanctity of the yuan, the renminbi? What is the backing going to be? And that's where you start to get some of these questions on fiat, which I think has always been in the back of everyone's mind and something to consider when you're looking at what is collateral, what is the ability for China to cover its debts. So when you look at what Russia is a major player in exporting, it's palladium, platinum, gold, gas, nickel, wheat, all of these things that are key raw materials from everything from cars on down, which is going to make the world, which has yet to recover from the COVID supply shock, even worse, which is why when you look at everything that has happened, versus 2011, which is the last time we had a more of a, not to say that this isn't an invasion, but a broader uprising across multiple different countries. And it was food. Food was the key driver and catalyst behind that. But we have broad issues now. This isn't just limited to one piece that then creates, obviously when oil goes up and food goes up, there's other pieces that knock on, but look at the raw materials and how integrated everything is and how much we need these pieces. So then when you look at Russia and Belarus, they're the leading exporters of fertilizers. So not only do they have the food side, but they also hold the rest of the world hostage, if you will, on the amount of fertilizer you can obtain. Now, the U.S. produces a decent amount. Obviously, Canada produces a lot. But when you look at nitrogen, look at Russia, Belarus, over 15%. Then you look at China. You look at Russia, Belarus for phosphate. almost 15%. You look at potash, almost 37%. So when you look at this, so the U.S. from its own perspective, we export phosphate. We do export some potash depending on where it is, but Canada's a huge exporter as well. So we pull down from Canada. But this is going to create a broader shortfall, because even if you had peace tomorrow, it doesn't mean you're going to be able to get all of these facilities back online, which just means that the yield around the world is going to struggle. And as the yield around the world struggles, we have not had bumper crops up to this point. We've only been draining storage in the excess, which again is leading to more potential for famine and bigger risks. And then when you look at Russia and Ukraine account for 28% of barley exports, and that was in 2020. And who's the most at risk from the Ukraine? China, which is, again, China is going to become a bigger and bigger buyer. As we've said previously, China was a big piece of buying 28 million tons of Ukrainian corn. 51% of Ukrainian barley was bought by China. You're seeing a lot in these knock-on effects that I think is one of the reasons why China also would like to see some semblance of normalcy, because they need this. But as we've said, even if there's normalcy today, there's still a huge amount of risk that this will take months, quarters, but more likely years to really start to straighten itself out. Now, when you look at the sanctions that have been put on Russia, they're now the most sanctioned country, topping Iran, to give you an idea of just what this means and just how that is going to impact things going forward. Again, they're fairly easy to take off once something or some sort of settlement is reached. But one of the things that will likely remain the case is Putin will stay sanctioned. But the key piece is taking away the sanctions from the people, because the last thing you want to do is give a populace a rallying cry. So some people there are like, look, those that watch the news or can get a VPN and see what's happening, they're like, this we shouldn't be here. This is wrong. We support Ukraine. We don't support Russia. But as stress increases, as their families struggle to eat, that pivots, that starts to change, because you love your family. You want your family to thrive and grow. So as your own family gets sick and can't have food, and then it's like, well, I didn't ask for Russia to go to war. Why am I getting penalized? So I think it has to be very clear that the moment this ends, the Russian people are made whole, Upwork, things start to come back. And because we have to take lessons from World War I. In World War I, our goal, if you will, was to make Germany pay, drag them through the mud. It's their fault this happened. We have to not do that, because World War I and the way we treated Germany after that helped give rise to Hitler. So you don't want to get rid of Putin or some, and then have something worse come along because you enraged a populace that had a unifying rallying cry. So that's why it's so important when you look at sanctions, and I know it's an overused word, but we talk about quote unquote exit ramps. Part of that needs to be, how do you make the people whole? How do you make sure that they don't, blame you for, their daughter or son, dying of starvation, or not being able to, not able to get the medical needs that they require. There's a lot of knock-on effects. And these are things that have to be really thought out and planned when you're looking at how do we go from this point forward. And that's when you start looking at other pieces. So what does the U.S. account for? So the U.S. accounts for 14% of wheat and mesclun exports, and in 2020 was the second largest exporter. So now it comes to, if Russia doesn't export, if Ukraine doesn't export, what can the U.S. accomplish? Can the U.S. backstop some of this? And the short answer is it can do some. And it'll also come down to, well, what happens with the amount of capacity that the U.S. has? Do we have a bumper crop? Will it be a good harvest? When will we be able to push more into the open market? And that's going to be some of the unknowns, because you can see here just the amount that Russia and Ukraine account for, with Russia essentially banning exports in the near term to solidify kind of what they need at home. And then when you look at the UN Food and Agriculture World Food Price Index, you can see it's above where we were in 2011, making new all-time highs. But then when you look at the food prices are at their highest level since 1974 in real terms. So obviously inflation is there. So let's take the inflation out and look at food in real terms. And it's above where we were in 2011, but it's now approaching where we were, and it's going to go above where we were in 1974. And I think that's the key, because when you look at the 70s, and this comes to when the Fed's raising rates, you had a wage spiral. And now, while I don't think a wage spiral is likely, it is possible. And food is one of the biggest drivers of some of those pieces, because living wages is how companies are going to dictate how some of these things are going to be dictated. And this is going to be a very important piece of where do wages go. And if they start to accelerate quickly, you can start to see that spiral, because if a company raises wages, that cost has to get passed through. And now, because people have higher wages, they can cover the cost. And then as the cost continues to go up, then they have to raise wages again. And then you can get an idea of how that cycle builds on itself. So this is just looking at global food prices, but then look at this is just taking mosaic, where fertilizer prices are, where fertilizer, where share prices are. And this is one of the reasons why we do think there is more upside when you look at the shortfalls and the amount of pricing that is going to come back into the market, and you're going to start to see some of these different pressure points as, again, they start to try to sell as much as they can into the market, but obviously getting higher prices. Now, when you look at Europe, because we're going to talk about Europe in a minute, Russia supplies the majority of oil imports from many European countries. So that's why when you look at Europe and where you're seeing some of these different pieces, we're right now starting to see an aggressive shift of, maybe we need to put not lockdowns, but work from home more, limit driving. And you're starting to see that come back into the fold, which again, because they're going to lose supply. So the best way to adjust that is try to find extra supply somewhere else, but also adjust demand. And that's where you're starting to see some of these pivots to try to account for what is going to be lost from Russian flow. Then when you look at China, and not only on the flow of oil, but this is also looking at the Ukrainian imports, the Chinese imports of Ukrainian corn and soybeans, and you can see just how much things have changed, but the corn was the big one. And how are they going to replace that? And the U.S. is kind of the likely answer, as well as Russia, but it's going to have to be what kind of deal does China and Russia make? And then when you think of the knock-on effects, who's going to be the most impacted from the lack of Ukrainian wheat? Indonesia, Egypt, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Morocco, Turkey. All of these countries are not exactly the most stable. And again, they're emerging markets, so they have subsidies. There's people there that have struggled to eat. So what is the cost going to be? What is the price going to be in order to go out and replace this? As we said before, China is one of the biggest importers and is going to have to be a bigger importer because they're losing this from other areas, i.e. Ukraine. So then when you look at EM, have seen a bigger food price surge recently than during the Arab Spring. That can't be ignored. The Arab Spring revolutions were at 2011, but when you look at pricing now, it is higher in emerging markets. So just to keep an idea of the pain that this is going to cause and why we focus so much on loss of demand and what is happening in the global market. Now, all of this is obviously going to lead to a rise in inflation. So here you're seeing that increase, that step up in inflation numbers. And just given, I think we've yet to see the true impacts of where this inflation is going to go because of the logistical problems, the raw material problems, all of the things that continue to hit us from COVID is going to continue to push that up higher. Then when you look at China's coking coal imports by origin, when you look at January to February 2021, Mongolia replacing Australia. Can China continue to play tough against Australia as they continue to have other shortfalls, as Russia comes under struggle to get coking coal out? As Indonesia, some of those flows continue to slow. These are some of those pieces, and China is essentially saying, "Oh, we're just going to increase our own throughput." It's like, well, can you, and how? So again, there's that price component. Then when you look at renewables, it remains a tiny part of the global energy mix, which is why when you look at the different pressure points, even though, yes, there's wind, there's solar, there's still a huge amount that's relied on when you look at the global energy mix, which is where you turn to Russia, and why we say Russia is going to have such an outsized impact, especially in Europe, when you look at the amount of flow that's coming. And then the contribution to the total inflation, it's core prices, it's financial. Like there's all these pieces that continue to get worse, especially on the core consumer price side, which when you look at how is that being derived, well, the Bloomberg Industrial Metals Subindex continues to push up. All these disruptions, all these problems on top of food, on top of crude, on top of gasoline, diesel, you name it. And this is creating, again, a lot of those different pressure points. So then when we look at some of the other pieces of where we sit and where things are going, you have to look at the dollar bond index versus commodity index. The dollar has gone flat as you've had this massive surge in commodities. And I think it's important to look at where some of these shifts are going to be. So the nominal yield curve is the most inverted between the 7 and 10-year treasuries going back to at least 2009. This is a direct result of bear flattening in the wake of the FOMC policy statement. So you're continuing to see these shifts. You're continuing to see these different pressure points that, again, are going to pivot kind of how does the dollar react and what happens to commodities as the U.S. kind of wakes up and starts to raise rates. But just highlighting just an example of the dependence that Europe has, and this is just looking right now at gas. Germany gets 2/3 of its natural gas from Russia. So 66.1% of gas comes from Russia, which is not something that's easily replaced. And how do you replace that? Where do you replace it from? Which is where we continue to see those pressure points. And then the investment risk by country. Netherlands and Ireland had most portfolio and foreign direct investment in Russia as a percent of GDP coming into the invasion. U.S. has exposure as well, but doesn't come close to the top. So these are also investments that, well, what is the collateral? What happens if there's a Russian default? Do you own credit default swaps? Will they be honored? And that's when you look to try to see who can make themselves whole and how you can have, again, those knock-on effects from the invasion. European gas storage is coming back into kind of the low end. So the storage is starting to flatlining. Obviously weather helps, seasonality helps. So there is some of that benefit. But again, there's still some of this outsized problems that will remain without trying to fix this, which is why Europe is in contact with Japan, other parts of Asia, to try to bring in additional LNG cargoes to refill storage to make sure that there's some of that bridge as we go into the end, essentially prepare for summer heating, for summer cooling, and then as well into winter heating. And that's when you start looking at all these different pieces. Britain, Germany, and Italy are suffering from the highest gasoline costs in Europe, which leads to, again, more inflation, more pain on the consumer, more issues on wages, which will become a much bigger problem when you start looking at recessions and an underlying pain for the region when we're looking at the impacts from Russia and beyond. So that's what we have for kind of that global look, especially on food. But the next segment, we're going to start global and kind of build it down into how is that going to impact the U.S. and what is going to happen to U.S. inflation over the next few months, and we're really through the rest of the year.